Welcome everyone. We are hosting our 7th webinar already on the UK's exit from the EU, and the series is organised by Universities UK International and the UK's Government Science and Innovation Network. For those who've already dialed in previously, you'll know me. I'm Anna Janssen, Head of European Engagement at Universities UK International, and co-hosts today are Francis Wood, who is Regional Director for the UK Science and Innovation Network for the wider Europe region, and also joining us is Gosia, who is European Advisor at the UK Research Office in Brussels. Just to say, the slides will be sent to you, as will a link to the recording, so you can look at this if you'd like at your leisure afterwards as well. In a couple of days, they just need to edit the recording a bit, and then we will send it around. As always, at the end of it, there will be time for Q&A, and Gosia will join us for that as well. So if you've got any questions, do send them throughout the webinar. And in the past, we've had moments where there were simply too many questions to answer while we were live. Don't worry about that. As soon as you send your question, basically we've got your information and your email, and we'll get back to you offline and answer your question offline. So we'll start with a very quick overview of where we are right now, the timeline, and what the withdrawal agreement really means, and then we will go into the different areas and what the withdrawal agreement and transition period mean for these different areas. Then we'll really discuss what happens next. The European Commission published a draft mandate for negotiations, and we'll discuss that. We'll also do a little bit of guesswork when it comes to which possible scenarios there might be up and coming, and last but certainly not least, also what you can do at your university and your field during this transition period. Like I said, Q&A at the end, and then Gosia will come back for all of that at the end of the webinar. So as you all know, on the 31st of January, the UK officially left the EU. So that meant that on February the 1st, the UK and the EU entered into the transition period. And that transition period lasts until the end of this calendar year, so until the 31st of December 2020. Then on the 1st of January 2021, the new relationship would have to be in place between the UK and the EU, which basically means that they have a little bit less than 11 months to get the free trade agreement or the new relationship in place. Now, before we start talking about the future, Francis is going to discuss with you the withdrawal agreement, the transition period, and already the first steps on what that means for research. Francis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Mai. So I think a lot of this information will be familiar, but I think that it's worth going through it again. In previous webinars, we have focused quite a bit on what might happen in the instance of a no deal and the safety net measures that the UK government had put in place. But this webinar, we will be focusing on what is happening now during the transition period and the withdrawal agreement. So it's just worth sort of going over some of these things again, but apologies if this is very familiar to many of you. So just to say, on the transition period, the current rules on trade, travel and business for the UK and the EU will continue to apply for the whole of the transition period. So some examples of what this means is travelling to and from the EU and the UK. It gives people the right to live and work in the EU and vice versa. And UK-EU trade will continue with the same rules as before. Next slide. But I think for this sector, the most relevant part of the withdrawal agreement relates to Horizon 2020. So I think this slide I might go over in quite some detail, because I think there has been some confusion in the sector, particularly when we were talking in the past quite a lot about no deal and underwrite guarantee and other things like that, which were necessary to talk about last year. But now that the withdrawal agreement is in place, that it's been agreed by both the UK and the EU, that doesn't apply anymore. So again, apologies if this is sort of familiar, but I think it is really worth sort of making this point about Horizon 2020 really clear. So UK scientists, researchers and businesses can continue to participate in, bid for and lead projects in Horizon 2020 under the EU's current multi-annual financial framework. This includes monobeneficiary schemes like MSCA, ERC grants, and the EIC Accelerator grant element. The Withdrawal Agreement also covers other programmes such as Euratom Research and Training and the Research Fund for Coal and Steel, but I won't talk about these in this webinar because I think most people are interested primarily in Horizon 2020. The point that I'd like to sort of really emphasise here is that successful projects with UK participants, whether they are in the lead or not, will receive EU grant funding for the lifetime of individual projects. So if you already have a project, it will be funded for the lifetime. If you put in a bid whilst Horizon 2020 is open and are successful, your project will be funded for the lifetime. So I think it's really important to emphasise that, because I think sometimes when we talk about the transition period or you read about it in the media, the date is the 31st of December 2020, and that's what people focus on. But actually for Horizon 2020, it's about the lifetime of the project and when Horizon 2020 is operating under the current MFF. So just really sort of thinking about Horizon 2020 and not thinking about the 31st of December 2020, because I think that is a bit of a sort of a distraction when it comes to this particular programme. As I said at the top, the UK has left the EU with a deal, so the things that we've spoken about in previous webinars are no longer necessary or applicable. As ever, with every scheme, there is a small possible exception. So there are potentially a very limited number of Horizon 2020 projects which require access to security-related sensitive information, which is restricted for EU member states. And as the UK is no longer a member state, we would then not be able to continue with these projects. But just again to emphasise that this is a very small number of projects, and we expect that the Commission will inform individual project holders or grant recipients if their project is affected in this way. But I will go into the contingency measures that the UK government has put in place for these very small number of projects. Next slide, please. So the exceptional cases. So we have established a continuation process for those projects that are affected. If you think that your project is affected, please do contact UKRI. The email address is on the slides, but also more information is available on the UKRI website. If your project is affected, there's essentially a two-step process, and each project will be assessed individually. So if your project is deemed that it can work as a standalone project without your EU partners, then you will receive funding for the lifetime of the project, capped at the remaining value of the original grant award. If it can't continue without your partners, then you'll enter what's called the non-viable projects process. And then this essentially allows you to claim back costs of closing down the project. Again, this is capped at the sort of original grant award value. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit to the future, one which is Horizon Europe, which is the next funding programme, and this is due to start from January next year. I think the point that I'd like to make first is that this is entirely separate to Horizon 2020. So whatever is or isn't agreed this year between the UK and the EU in regards to Horizon Europe will not affect Horizon 2020. So everything that I've just said about projects being eligible for lifetime of the project funding, that still stands even and is completely separate to any negotiations on Horizon Europe. So I think here the government has said that we are, as the UK, ready to consider participation in certain EU programmes, but we need the EU to agree its sort of baseline, so its budget, between 2021 and 2027. And we also need to make an assessment about the overall value to the UK of joining any such programmes. So I think there has been some media reporting that says, a decision has been made or hasn't been made. So just to sort of emphasise that currently no decision has been taken by the UK government on association. And this is partly because the budget and the rules of association for third countries hasn't yet been fixed by the EU. So we are looking at a wide range of different options to ensure that the UK keeps its global sort of leadership position. And I will talk about one of those particular strands in a little bit more detail. So back to you, Anna-Mai, and then I'll talk about visas in a little bit.
Thanks, Francis. Once the slide went a little bit too quickly, sorry. So yeah, from research we go into Erasmus Plus and the withdrawal agreement and what that means for Erasmus Plus. And it's the same story basically as with Horizon 2020. UK's participation in Erasmus Plus program is protected due to the withdrawal agreement. So that really means that all mobilities that happen within the current Erasmus Plus program will continue as normal, as as planned really, and that includes mobilities that are funded in the current program but that don't happen until after the 31st of December 2020. The withdrawal agreement applies to the entire Erasmus program, so that includes Key Action 2 calls, which include the international collaborative projects. And again, here also the same thing applies as with Horizon 2020, that these projects, because they're multi-annual, they are protected for the lifetime of these projects, and you'll get the funding for as long as these projects last. The message that I really want to give to our European viewers, our European audience, is that it's really important to know that nothing has changed in the UK's status in Erasmus+. There are no changes coming up. We have got the withdrawal agreement and transition period now, which just basically means that we're in the rest of the program and nothing will change. So you can really rest assured and send your students to UK universities with the Erasmus Plus program, and also host UK students. So these partnerships can continue to go on, and really nothing changes there. Then, as Francis did for Horizon Europe, I want to have a little bit of a chat about the next Erasmus programme. The UK government has said from the beginning that they are open to negotiating access to the next Erasmus programme. In my opinion, they've been as positive publicly as they really can be, but it's good to be reminded, I think, that although it's scary for the UK and for us because we've never negotiated association before, there is a route to do it, and other countries who are associated to these programs have done it in the past. It's our time to do it for the first time, and that's maybe a bit scary, and that gives uncertainty and unease, and I completely understand that, but there is a route to do it, and the government has been saying that they want to start the negotiations on these programs. I do understand why people might think, why doesn't the UK government just say outright, we want full association to these programs? And my answer to that is that even if the government wanted to say that from the get-go, they can't, for the reasons that Francis already said, is that the programs still need to be finalised. So for Horizon Europe, the content of the programme is finalised, but not the budget yet. And for Erasmus, both the budget and the content still need to be finalised. So naturally, the UK can't commit to something before knowing what you're getting, before knowing what the annual fee is that you're going to pay into to participate, but also what the content of the programme are and what the terms of association are. And also, this doesn't just apply to the UK, this applies to other countries that have to negotiate association as well. Again, it's the first time we're doing it, so it's a bit scary. And the tricky part really is, but we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth later, is that the processes within the EU for finalising these programmes, it looks likely that they will be delayed, which then impacts when the UK and the EU can start talking about the UK's association to these programmes. Another thing that I really wanted to discuss was something that got a lot of media attention a couple of weeks ago. It was an amendment to the withdrawal agreement bill on Erasmus, and it was early January, and it was the Lib Dems that proposed that amendment, and then the amendment was rejected. And because the amendment was rejected, it got a lot of media attention, and more unhelpfully, that generated a lot of misunderstanding about what that amendment meant and what the rejection of that amendment meant. I think there are a couple of things that are important here. First, the amendment was in relation to the new Erasmus program, so it had nothing to do with the current program. It was in no way related to the current program, and again, the UK remains a part of the current program for the rest of the program, and also, as I said, projects that run past the end of the transition period, so nothing changed there. What the amendment really tried to do was to compel the government, and these are the words, compel the government to seek to negotiate continuing full membership of Erasmus+. Again, next program, not current program. And although it would have been a really nice signal, not just to us as a sector, but also to our European partners, if that amendment was accepted to really, you know, as a sign of goodwill, nothing really has changed with the amendment not being accepted. And even if it was accepted, accepting that amendment would not have guaranteed UK's full participation in Erasmus, because the circumstances remained the same, being the government has already said a couple of times that they want to negotiate access to the programme, so that hasn't changed. And the reality still is that the programme and the budget need to be finalised, which are the two key things that determine when we can start talking about this programme. So the amendment would just want to, compel the government to seek to negotiate, which is something they were already planning to do. And it's up to the negotiations, really, what our role and our participation in the Erasmus Plus program from 2021 onwards will be. The amendment was never going to change that. On a positive note, this all gathered a lot of media attention, and our university's Minister Chris Skidmore tweeted that the vote didn't prevent the UK from participating in Erasmus+, and that the UK government highly values international student exchanges. So that's a positive. But just to repeat once more, to get any confusion out there, just get rid of it. The UK is fully part of the current Erasmus programme, nothing changes, and the future programme, that is something that is up for the negotiations. Then on student fees, EU nationals who start their courses in the UK in the 2020-2021 academic year are eligible for home fee status and for financial support for the whole duration of their course. The UK government is aware that there is a question about what will happen with the 2021-2022 fee status. We know that application for the courses starting in that academic year will start now in September, but we are also aware that at universities, the recruitment cycle is already underway. And the government is aware of this as well. And they've said that they will try and get some communications on this and a decision on this out there as soon as possible. We, as in Universities UK, we want stability for the sector for 2021, just because the university sector needs some time for these big changes to be implemented. And we are actually asking for, let's just keep the fee status the same for that year and create some stability for the sector, just realizing that the recruitment cycles are already underway. But you have to look at the other side as well, flip it around, and then you look at fees for UK students who want to study in the EU. Now, for the transition period, because EU law continues to apply, UK students who want to study in the EU and will start their course in 2020-2021, they will pay the national level of student fees, so not any international fees. And after that, it's really up to the individual member states what they'll do, unless, for example, the EU and the UK included in a free trade agreement. But to be very honest, I've got no idea on whether or not that is something that they will seriously consider to put in a free trade agreement. And I think if it were, it would be maybe something for a discussion a little bit later down the line. That's all I wanted to say on Erasmus. Francis, will go back to you and we'll talk about immigration rules.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was just having slight issues with my mute button there. So I will talk a little bit about the sort of current immigration rules and then a little bit about the future. So in the transition period, as I've already said at the beginning, freedom of movement continues to apply. But there are sort of various schemes for those EU citizens who are in the UK and UK citizens in EU countries to sort of essentially formalise and fix that status after the transition period ends. So a lot of this is very familiar to people, but I will go through it very quickly. So for EU, EEA or Swiss citizens who are sort of in the UK or who moved to the UK before the end of the transition period, there is the EU settlement scheme. More information is available on this on the gov.uk website. But I think the point that I'd like to sort of particularly highlight here again is a date point. So the transition period runs until the 31st of December 2020. But the date for continuing to live in the UK is the 30th of June 2021, and the deadline for applying to the settlement scheme is the 30th of June 2021. So again, it's just sometimes in the media, all of the attention is on the 31st of December date, but actually for the settlement scheme, there is a different date, a deadline for sort of applications. Then just to talk a little bit about EU citizens in EU countries. So this is covered in the Withdrawal Agreement, and as I said at the beginning, the Withdrawal Agreement applies, so this won't change. So the discussions and negotiations that will happen this year between the UK and the EU about our future relationship will not change the Withdrawal Agreement. So citizens' rights are protected. So just to sort of say that again, it's a similar thing that if you are a UK national living lawfully residing in another EU country by the end of the transition period, your rights are protected. It allows you to stay in that EU country. You will continue to have broadly the same entitlements to work, study and access public services and benefits. However, each country has a different process for how you effectively prove that you were resident in the country, that you're lawfully resident. And at least until the 30th of June 2021 to do that. So you need to understand what the rules and process is in the individual EU country that you might be living in, and the UK government has produced living in guides on gov.uk which sort of explain that process and what you need to go through. So unfortunately there isn't sort of one process for all EU member states, but there is a process in each member state. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit to the future, so this is from the 1st of January 2021 onwards, and this is separate to what I was talking about for those UK citizens living in EU countries and EU citizens living in the UK who move before the end of the transition period and apply for sort of various residency or settlement schemes. This is about sort of essentially people who have not moved before, who have not moved before that date. So it's very clear that for holidays and short trips, EU citizens, EEA and Swiss citizens will not need a visa for short trips coming into the UK. You will need a valid passport, and the UK will introduce a new points-based immigration system from January 2021 onwards. There hasn't yet been an announcement of what that system will look like and how it will operate, but announcements will be made in due course. But I think for this sector in particular, there is already something that has been announced, and I will talk a bit about that scheme now. So we have a new global talent visa scheme, and this will start operation from the 20th of February this year, so in about 8 days' time. And this is a fast-track scheme for individuals who are sort of researchers, scientists, mathematicians, academics, who would like to come and work in the UK. So there are 4 routes here. So one is around senior appointments, and this is tied to specific jobs. So this is if you're appointed as a professor, associate professor, etc. And where that job is an eligible higher education institution or research institute. The second way is around fellowships. So this is on, if individuals have been given a fellowship by a list approved by the British Academy, the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society. And the fellowship must be currently held or within the last 12 months. The third route is endorsed funders. So this in some ways is the most interesting and sort of different route to what has been on offer before. So this is where if you are in receipt of funding from a particular institution, body, then you can essentially apply to come and work in the UK. There is a full list on the UKRI website of which institutions and awards are eligible for this, but there are 120 different awards and grants. So the list is pretty long here. And it does include those that are in receipt of Horizon 2020 awards like ERC grants. So I think that this is really important message to show that the UK is open and that we welcome researchers from around the world. The fourth is around peer review. So this is if individuals submit an application to the British Academy, the Royal Academy of Engineering or the Royal Society and sort of seek endorsement. So these things are quite specific, but essentially the main message of this global talent visa is that there is a vast array of jobs or grants or other things that you can be a receiver of, and you can receive a fast track visa. Next slide, please. So I think there's some elements of this scheme that are really worth highlighting, because these are some things that we've heard from the sector that have been of concern in the past. So if you're in receipt of a particular grant or award, you can also bring your teams with you. So it's not just focused on the individual researcher. It's not restricted to certain sectors or topics. So I think there was some media reporting when this was announced, asking, is it just applicable to those in the sort of hard sciences or mathematics sector? You know, what about humanities? And actually, if you look at the list of eligible grants and awards, it's really broad. So, for example, you know, those in receipt of Horizon 2020 awards, that's not restricted just to specific sectors. You do not have to have a minimum salary to be eligible, which I think is really important for young career researchers. Dependents will have full access to the UK labour market. Again, it's not thinking about researchers as individual atoms, but thinking about who's around them, whether that's their team or their families. And for certain routes under that visa route, you do not have to hold a specific offer of employment before arriving. So I think, again, really important that you're not tying individuals to a specific job or institution. It also provides an accelerated path to settlement who are endorsed on the route. And I think also another key point is that it has an exemption from absence rules, because we recognise that a lot of researchers need to do research elsewhere in the world, not in the UK, in order to advance their particular projects. And so you won't be penalised for doing what you need to do in order to do your research. Thank you. Next slide, please. And it's not just about researchers, it's also thinking about those who have just graduated. So this announcement about postgraduate visa extension has been around, and I think we spoke about it in the last webinar. But again, for completeness, I think it's worth sort of emphasising that this exists and what the change is. So essentially, international students will be able to apply to stay post-study for up to 2 years, which is an extension from the current 6 months. And this route is available to international students who have completed undergraduate study at a valid higher institution provider. It will be quite light touch in terms of the process, and it will be launched in the summer of 2021. And there won't be any cap on this route. So if you're eligible under it and you meet all the requirements in terms of the identity and security checks, then you will be able to stay in the UK post-study for up to 2 years. So now I think back to Anna May for professional qualifications. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. So we'll move on to a couple of other topics now, starting with professional qualification recognition. So during the transition period, EU law, continues to apply in the UK, and that includes the MRPQ directive, so the Directive on Mutual Recognition of Professional Qualifications. This means that if you already have a qualification that is recognized under the MRPQ directive, you won't have to do anything. And if you obtain a new qualification during the transition period, then also that will be recognized. And the recognition of those people who already have a qualification or will get their qualification during the transition period will remain valid after the transition period. So for new qualifications that will have to be recognised after 2021, the UK has said that they'd like to include this in a free trade agreement with the EU, and until that is the case, or if it's not included in a free trade agreement, you will need to have your UK professional qualification recognised by the appropriate national regulator in the country, in the member state country that you want to work. Just to reiterate something that I've said, I think in every previous webinar, is that this is really different from the recognition of academic qualifications. Academic qualifications are part of the Bologna process. The Bologna process is an intergovernmental process, not EU solely. So that means that the UK is still a part of it and will remain a part of it. So that won't be influenced by the exit. Then the same logic applies to data protection. Because EU law continues to apply in the UK, the General Data Protection Regulation also continues to apply in the UK. So for the transition period, nothing changes, and there's nothing you need to do to continue exchanging data with your European partners or the other way around. Looking for 2021 onwards, we know that the UK government is seeking agreement with the EU on data adequacy, which is a decision that the Commission can make, saying basically your legislation is in line with our general data protection regulation, and there is no, we can just continue to exchange data. I personally think it shouldn't be a huge hurdle because the UK has the general data protection regulation at the moment, and not all of a sudden stuff will change on the 1st of January 2021. But the European Commission will want to go through the process of assessing that and having the process it needs to do in order to come to an adequacy decision. If this agreement or this adequacy decision isn't reached before the end of the transition period, then there are measures that organizations can put in place to continue to share data with their EU partners and the other way around. For example, you can include a standard contractual clause in your contracts between UK and EU partners to do that. Have I just, sorry, just gonna, yeah, there we are again. We're at full screen again. Apologies for that. So next bit that I wanted to discuss is the European Commission's draft mandate for the negotiations. So on the EU side, the planned timeline is to have this draft mandate agreed on the 25th of February by the EU 27, so that the negotiations on the free trade agreement can start on the 3rd of March. The draft mandate does refer to the possibility for the UK to extend the transition period, but the UK government has already said that this is not something that they want. So in terms of governance, what the draft mandate really says is that the Commission wants to pursue a structure that has kind of an overarching framework covering all areas of cooperation, under which then separate areas of cooperation would be negotiated more in detail. The Commission reiterates several times in the draft mandate that they want a balance of rights and obligations, and that there needs to be a level playing field. Then, zooming in on the topics relevant for higher education and research, of course, participation in union programs is mentioned. And what you see there as well is that the EU wants to establish general principles for the participation in union programs, but recognizes that there might be specific conditions for specific programs that need to be fleshed out. So again, what you'll probably see is a sort of an umbrella framework for all the union programs horizontally, and then the option to negotiate the terms for the different programs underneath that. On mobility, the Commission has a couple of lines in there which basically say that mobility arrangements, including visa-free travel for short-term stays in the envisioned partnership, should be based on non-discrimination between the Union member states and full reciprocity. Then another thing they say is that the envisioned partnership should aim at setting out the conditions for entry and stay for purposes of research, study, training, and youth exchanges. So you can clearly see the reference to the Union programs there. Then on data protection, the draft mandate sets out that the EU could adopt an adequacy decision, just like the UK government said that they'd like to pursue if the UK meets the conditions. So that is the process that the Commission needs to go through to assess that, and that would allow an adequacy decision would allow for data to continue to be exchanged under the same rules as it is right now. Then on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, we just talked about it. The lines in the draft mandate basically say that the envisioned partnership should include a framework for negotiations on the conditions for competent domestic authorities to recognise professional qualifications. So you see the language there is a little bit different than what the UK government has said. The UK government said, we want to continue mutual recognition of professional qualifications, while on the EU side, they more talk about setting up a framework for domestic authorities in the countries to recognise professional qualifications. I mean, this is just the start of the negotiations, and we'll have to see what happens. But it looks like that they might be looking for slightly different things here, and it will be interesting to see what will be the result of the negotiations on this. Then, of course, we don't know how the coming year will develop, but I thought it would be nice to kind of run you through a couple of possible scenarios and what they mean, basically, and what we need for each scenario. First question, of course, is whether the UK and the EU are successful in concluding a free trade agreement in the time allotted, and whether or not the higher education and research field is mentioned in that free trade agreement. Now, it is our understanding that even if higher education and research aren't mentioned in a free trade agreement, or if we don't, there's not enough time, for some reason we're not successful in getting an FTA yet at the end of this year, it would be possible to have separate agreements on Erasmus Plus and Horizon Europe. However, I think it's important to know that in addition to that process ongoing of the negotiations for the free trade agreement, the other thing which we've been discussing already quite a few times, which will really impact when we can associate and if we can associate and when the discussions can start, is the wrap up of the EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework. It is the budget for the next 7 years. It covers everything, including the union programs, and it looks likely that the finalization of the budget will be delayed. There is an extraordinary EU summit happening on the 20th of February, where the EU will try to break the deadlock on these discussions, because it seems that member states are quite set in what they want, and there's not a lot of moving towards each other happening. And if the EU budget is delayed, then the budget for Horizon Europe and Erasmus are delayed as well. And when they are delayed, that means we can't start talking about access to these programs yet. But that applies to everyone. That doesn't just apply, to all the associated countries. That doesn't just apply to us. It applies to all the countries that have to negotiate access anew. So basically, you'll have a couple of scenarios now. The very first one, the best one, the one we're all hoping for, is that the UK is fully associated to Horizon Europe and Erasmus Plus on the 1st of January 2021, and that means that the budget negotiations were all on time, and the negotiations for access between the UK and the EU all were successful and on time. So that's the one we're all rooting for. Then the second one is no association yet on the 1st of January 2021, because negotiations haven't been finalized yet, but they're wrapping it up. For example, it would look likely that we'd be part of it, but they need a couple of more months to wrap it up. So you'd only have a small gap, basically, and you'd need something in place from that would bridge that little gap from the 1st of January 2021 until we are finally associated to these programs. Another second scenario within that scenario is if that gap is bigger, because the EU budget takes longer to be finalized, means that the negotiations are delayed, and then you'd have a more severe delay, and then you really need something else that the Commission and the UK government, or something that the Commission would come up with, put in place. Because again, if that happens, none of the programs start if the budget is delayed. you'd need something to be put in place to bridge that longer term gap. And then the third option is negotiations fail, and it doesn't look likely that the UK will associate to Horizon Europe and Erasmus+, and then we really on the UK side need a very ambitious national replacement schemes for these two programs, and you'd want it to be ready to go on the 1st of January 2021, and this is something that we are talking to government about. I mean, our preference, and we make that very, very clear, is always to be associated to these programs, but you know, in case that doesn't happen, you do need something to be able to keep working with your European partners. Now, quickly, a couple of things that we as Universities UK are asking and want from this future relationship, and those who have tuned into our previous webinars, this won't be a surprise. Full association to Horizon Europe and Erasmus+, an immigration system that supports universities' ability to attract European and global talent with minimal barriers, scholarships for EU students, as is the case for non-EU students already. Of course, continued mutual recognition of professional qualifications. It would be most beneficial if that were, if it was able to agree on that on a bilateral scale between the EU and the UK. And then, of course, something in the services, well, it's now the Services Directive, but in the future, agreement on services that would allow the delivery of transnational education services with minimal barriers, effectively. So what can you do, basically? Well, a couple of things I think are really important. During this transition period is really make sure you have the right information. We get quite a few emails, not just from our universities, but also from universities in the UK that then have partners in Europe who, for example, think that they can't send their students anymore because they misunderstand the transition period, or researchers that you know, aren't involved in projects that they should be. So it's really, really crucially important that everyone has the latest and the most up-to-date information, which is the transition period. Make sure that we are fine at the moment in these current programs. So I'd like to ask people working at UK universities to use that information and distribute it widely in your European and international networks. The EUA, the European University Association, has written a very, very good briefing, and I've got the link in the slide about what the transition period means. And also our own website has the latest information, which you can consult and check and use to send around. So I'd really, really encourage you to do that. And then just for our European partners, you know, keep working with us. Like I said, nothing's changing now, and we will do our very, very, very best for the future, but just keep working with us because we don't want there to be dip, basically, if it's absolutely unnecessary. Then on the future relationship, again, twofold. Keep working with us, and as we work to try and get access to these programs, reach out to organizations like ourselves, Universities UK, but also the EUA, if you want to have some more detailed information so that you have the latest information. Reach out to us if you've got any questions. We're, you know, not just for our UK universities, but if you're working at a university somewhere in Europe and you've got a question, we're very, very happy to help and answer any questions you've got. So reach out to us and just keep working with us. So basically, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you for listening. And Gosia has joined us again for the Q&A session. And I just wanted to, before we dive into the questions, just ask Gosia, is there anything you want to add or want to say before we dive into the questions?
Yes, can you see me?
We hear you. Just look. Yes,
Hello.
you're live. Hi.
Thank you. So thank you, Anna-May and Francis. So what can I say? I can say a big thank you for having this webinar today on the 12th day of the transition period, because it was a great summary and clear information, clear message on the continuation of UK eligibility in program for our sector. Visibly, we have nearly 500 attendees today, and that's great, because what I would like to say is to encourage everyone to rely on official information, just like this webinar, and not only follow media coverage that can sometimes be confusing. And the key takeaway message is really everything stays for the UK applicants this year as it is. So no restrictions in eligibility. And we are today on the 12th of February, and there are loads of open calls, upcoming calls of Horizon 2020 and Erasmus. So all you need to do is to keep applying this year and make most of this transition period and of the remaining of the programs. UKRO also, of course, provide guidance on the process. We have our fact sheet on ukro.ac.uk, which has been very popular. It's now updated, of course, following the recent developments. And we will continue to provide clear guidance and help people navigate through whatever will happen this year. But for now, the key message is just keep applying. And we, of course, are happy to answer any questions. And we also linked with BASE and ACRI colleagues who work on this. So, and of course, with you as well. And we will keep doing this to make sure the message is spread out UK and Europe as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Gosia. So we'll dive into the questions. I'll just have to look at my screen, which maybe looks a bit off for you guys. But okay, I think the first one, Francis, is for you. Apologies. Is the global talent visa open-ended? Meaning, would it enable someone to reside in the UK as their main residence, even if settled status isn't pursued? Is the global talent visa? Yeah, sorry, that was just repeating the same sentence. So did you get that, Francis?
Yes, so thank you very much. So I think here, just to clarify that settled status and the global talent visa are completely separate. And so with the global talent visa, in some ways it depends which of the routes that you come through. So the route which I mentioned about senior appointment, so for example, if you were appointed as a professor at a particular university, your visa would apply for however long you were professor for. After 3 years in the UK, on this scheme, you would be able to apply for sort of permanent residency in the UK. So this is the accelerated part of the scheme, because for people on other visa routes have to reside in the UK for a longer period of time. So in some ways, to answer your question, it depends on which way you come in through the global talent visa. So some of them are open-ended because they're tied to particular jobs. Some are less open-ended because they apply to particular fellowships. So I would advise you to go to the UKRI website and have a look through the sort of individual criteria. But just to clarify that this scheme is completely separate to the settled status scheme.
Thanks, Francis. Question number 2 for you, Gosia. Do we no longer need to worry about project eligibility for Horizon 2020, meaning number of member states and associated countries?
Yes, that's correct. You don't need to worry about the eligibility. The UK counts as member state associated country, so the minimum counts towards the minimum required by particular call, and including mono-beneficiary calls. So individual fellowships and ERC grants are open still this year to the UK applicants. Okay,
thank you. Then next question, how is this going to affect the 2021-2022 Students University Institution? Students University Institution,
maybe the fees?
Oh yeah, you might mean the fees. If it's the fees, my colleague is nodding his head, so I think it's the fees. This basically what I said previously. So for the 2020-2021, where EU students pay the same as home fee status and also are allowed or entitled to financial support. We don't have an announcement yet from government on the 2021-2022 year. Government is aware of it. They said they would try and make an announcement on it as soon as possible. We as a sector are basically saying, you know, it's recruitment cycles are already underway. We need stability for that period. University sector needs some time to make these adjustments. So we're actually asking to keep them the same for that year as well for EU students. But we don't know yet. Government will come with an announcement hopefully soon. Let me go to the next one. Okay, are you aware of any measures being taken to allow medical exchange students to come to the UK to undertake clinical placements on exchange, either without needing visa or going through some new visa route from UKRI. This doesn't ring a bell with me. I'm assuming medical exchange students. Oh, here we go again. My webinar, my slides are not really working for me today. Let's see. So this is about medical exchange students who come to the UK to undertake clinical placements to exchange. I would assume this is research related. Francis, do you know?
I don't. I would just say that for the transition period, whatever has been possible before the 31st of January is still possible this year, but we can take that, because it's quite a specific question, away, and we will endeavour to get you an answer.
Yeah, exactly. If the person who sent that question, maybe follow it up with a more extensive one, and we'll reach out to you via email and make sure that we give you the right answer to that one. Okay, next one. If Erasmus Plus is covered for the lifetime of the funding, does this include Erasmus Mundus joint master degrees? Yes, it does. Yes, it definitely does. So yeah, again, it includes projects and Mundus that go beyond the 31st of December 2020, so that is covered. The next question. Can you please let me know if a recording will be made available? Yes, as I said from the start, both the slides and the recording will be made available, and it will be sent to you in a couple of days. Our IT team just need to kind of make sure that the beginning and the end are nicely done, and we'll put it online and we'll send you the recording and the slides. Just one last question to wrap up, and then we'll end the webinar. Are you absolutely sure that UK researchers can participate in Horizon 2020 projects? Because I've heard from partners that they can't. Francis, do you want to take this one?
It's very simple. They can.
And just to reiterate, the same goes for Erasmus. And if you get these messages from European partners that they can't, reach out to national agencies, reach out to the official bodies, and they will give you the official line that it is. So then you have something to go back to your European partners with, saying, you know, sorry, this is incorrect. The UK can't. So there are different things that we can that are out there that you can use for your communication. So just to wrap up, I just want to thank everyone for listening, for dialing in. It's really, really appreciated. I hope it's helpful. That is why we do this. If there were any questions left unanswered, we will get back to you afterwards offline. And I really would want to thank Francis and Gosia for joining us. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much for doing this. It's really, really very much appreciated. And yeah, again, the slides and recordings and everything will be sent to you in a couple of days. So thank you, everyone, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.